Hello, I'm Mark Bowden, and I'm one of the trustees of the Afghanistan Society. And I'm very honoured to be joined by a major figure in British diplomacy, Sir Nicholas Barrington. His career spans decades and a range of senior and important posts in Whitehall as well as overseas. But it's his time as Oriental Secretary in the British Embassy in Kabul and later as British High Commissioner to Pakistan in the late 1980s that forms the heart of our conversation. At a time when Afghanistan was caught in the grip of Soviet occupation and Cold War rivalries were playing out in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, Sir Nicholas was at the centre of British efforts to understand and respond to the rapidly changing dynamics in the region. His observations and reflections remain as relevant today as they were during the final years of the Mujahideen resistance. We'll talk about diplomacy under pressure, the nature of Afghan society, the role of Britain in South Asia, and how Afghanistan's rich cultural history continues to shape its destiny. But we'll also touch on more personal moments, what it felt like to live and work in Kabul, and later observe Afghanistan from Islamabad at such pivotal times. So Nicholas, thank you so much for being with us. Let me begin with a question of first impressions. When you first arrived in Afghanistan as Oriental Secretary, what struck you most, not just politically, but personally about the country and its people?
I realized it was completely new to me. I was driving out from Iran through the border, through Herat, right overland to Kabul. That was in 1959, on a road which was quite difficult to be careful not to fall into great pits in the road and to be safe. And when you got to a bridge, the sensible thing was probably to avoid the bridge completely and be safer in your car. And when I got to the embassy, it was a compound, a British embassy compound. I had a small house in the compound, and since it was my own house, and I had a Tiger Kashmiri who was my sort of looking after me and looking after it was an honour and a pleasure for me. It was a strange embassy because the ambassador was a remote figure. He was a specialist in Chinese calligraphy and only came to the office hardly ever, and we came to see him once a week. So I was the only person in this small embassy who spoke a bit of Persian. I spoke actually Afghan Persian. Of course, people talk about Afghan Persian and Persian. The Afghans eliminated some of the Arabic from the Persians, which the Iranians had put in. And they called their Persian Dari, but it's the same language but different accent. And in fact, my job was partly to be in charge of information and press relations. And one of the things I did when I got to know the people in charge of Radio Kabul was suggest, why don't they have a program of English language on Radio Kabul, which they'd never had. I made this suggestion. I was quite a junior diplomat then, and I didn't hear anything for some time. And then a few months later, I think, they said, we'd like a British language radio program. What a good idea. Please start it tomorrow or the next week. And there was no one really to do that except some English teachers in the local school who, between us, we worked out a sort of program, and we had a character which I played, speaking Persian and English in this program. And again, months later, I was caught in Kabul by a friend who introduced himself to me and I to him. And he heard me and he said, you're our English teacher on Radio Kabul, because I recognise your strange hybrid accent. I used to call myself a haramzadeh, a bastard accent, which is half Kabuli and half Tehran. Basically, I was the only person in the embassy who spoke a bit of Persian. So I was the main person for personal contact with Afghans.
So perhaps you could give us some idea of what the job of the Oriental Secretary comprised, and perhaps some of the engagements you had. I believe you engaged quite a lot with the royal family.
When I was there, I thought there'd been a whole long series of Oriental Secretaries, but in fact, in the old days, when British had any sort of missions there, they were usually experienced Indians or, of course, now people who now would be Indians or Pakistanis, who were based in Kabul looking after British interests. And the Oriental Secretary from the West was comparatively recent. The job of an Oriental Secretary was to be the one person in the small embassy who spoke a bit of Persian and could have mixed with Persian people. I mean, Afghan people. And that's what I enjoyed doing. And the Afghans themselves were happy to find someone in the embassy who they can talk to and meet socially with all sorts of mixtures of people. And of course, the influential people in those days were the royal family. The country was really run by the royal family. The previous king had been murdered just before the Second World War, and the new king was a gentle, kind fellow, but the power was in the hands of his brothers-in-law and his nephews, Prime Minister Dowd and Foreign Minister Naim. And they were tough characters, and large numbers of their families and royal families had almost all the important jobs in government. So it was my job to get to know them and talk to them and to learn about what was going on in the country through them.
And I think you mention in your book the importance that the royal family had in modernising Afghanistan.
Yes. Prime Minister Dowd, although he was a tough character, who wouldn't stand much problems from any religious people or anything like that, nevertheless, he did try gradually to bring some Western ideas into Afghan life. He started some schools and things, and there was one occasion which I was present at, because every year they had a special Jashan ceremony on an open bit of ground. It was the national day, really. And they had a parade when they paraded some guns which had been captured from the British in the Second Afghan War. Then they had performances in the stadium, bullfights, cockfights, all these other things, and some sort of sporting activities. But on one occasion, I saw to my surprise that there were women of the royal family appearing for the first time without a veil. The first day was the foreign minister, Dowd's wife, who appeared without a veil. The next day, her daughters and several other people appeared without veils too. It was a major gesture by the government that they were going to try and liberalise the policy. But actually, that liberalisation was one of the good stages that took place under the Prime Minister Dowd. The Prime Minister Dowd, the main problem was that he was, first of all, he was determined to keep control of the country absolutely, through the army and so on. Secondly, is he allowed lots of army officers to be trained in Russia. And the other thing he did was to argue for Pashtunistan, for a Pashto language, and for control over the area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that caused huge problems for us, because we naturally were friends with Pakistan, who was a member of the Commonwealth. And Dowd was rather strange, because the royal family actually spoke Persian. They spoke Dari. They didn't speak Pashto. But this question of promoting Pashtunistan was a problem which made slightly difficult our relations with Afghanistan that time.
While you were there as Oriental Secretary, I believe you travelled fairly extensively in Afghanistan. It would be useful to have some of your impressions of travelling in Afghanistan at that time, and what your impressions were, for example, in Nuristan.
Thank you. My job, of course, was to have the contacts at home, but I did want to travel a bit. And I travelled around the country, first of all. At one point in these travels, we drove on narrow roads, winding narrow roads, quite dangerous roads, right up to the town of Faizabad, near where lapis lazuli has been mined in the area, and other places in the north. I went originally with an embassy driver and one Land Rover. The roads were so appalling, and one time we found the whole of the substructure of the car had been broken. But we stopped at a little Afghan town, and the local mechanics sorted it out really quickly. They were very competent mechanics at dealing with problems on the way. I remember sometimes going through areas where there were hordes of wild horses going across the desert. Interesting experience. And then there were people riding along with hawks in their hands, because that was the tradition. It was a fascinating country, and the areas in the distances, the people, they were very polite to me as a visitor at that time. And there was no problem about being British. I remember in the bazaar in Kabul, you could pass an English cheque and give it to one of the merchants down in the bazaar, and you'll find the money came back later by having passed through Hong Kong and London and God knows where. I mean, so the British had a reputation in those days of being honourable and decent. But the most exciting thing I did was to go with two colleagues, one from Germany and one from America. We decided we wanted to try and get to Nuristan as a special visit to a remote part of the country which had not been visited hardly at all. And there we managed to get permission, and it was arranged that we would go, the three of us, with an interpreter, and see what we could make of visiting this area of Nuristan, which was a part of the country where for a long time there'd been no religions followed, and they had their own life of their own, and they were very unknown to the outside world. It was a mysterious, fascinating place, and I eventually enjoyed it and wrote about it.
Could you elaborate a bit more on your impressions of life in Nuristan?
Yes, the main thing was that once you got in there, in the property, you couldn't drive anywhere, that the roads were impossible for driving or even for horses or donkeys. And so you had to walk. The rocks were very craggy and difficult. The rivers were extremely fast-flowing and rash. The bridges over them were thin structures of wood which you had to balance as you went right over the bridges from one side to the other. Because many of the people, actually the farms where mostly the women worked were down by the river, but the men lived up high up on the crags. The first place we got to, the major place we got to was Wama, where we arrived at the bottom. We had to climb right the way up through craggy things to the top, where we talked to the people in the Wama, and I managed to talk to quite a few of them in Persian. I met one old man with a white beard who was very interested in talking to me and who spoke Persian very easily, and he had an expression. Several of the Nuristanis, being a rather exceptional people, not following religions, had been attached to the royal family at various times as servants. And he had been attached to the Amir of Kabul in the 1920s, 1930s, on a visit to India. And he'd actually travelled to India with his Amir as part of the staff. And he had some experience of the outside world. Fascinating, this old man. He got rid of a stick I had rather proudly, which had to sort of get over the rocks and things. He threw it away, said, "That's no good," and gave me his own stick, which I still keep and value of that lovely old man who was kind to me and who was courteous and who was interested in what I had to say.
I remember that you also have some interesting sort of concerns about the Kuchi population and the restrictions that increasingly came upon the Kuchi population with divisions of the border. How did you engage with the Kuchis?
The tribes, of course, were the main problem. One had to know the main tribes in the country. And quite apart from the main tribes, some of them were tribes that moved backwards and forwards from Afghanistan down into India, originally, then into Pakistan. Because in the summer they were in the high areas, and in the winter they were down in the warmer areas. And there were Kuchi groups which were quite small. I've got, I think, one picture of in my book. Maybe a group of about 30 people with camels and donkeys, women on the backs and strapped, and travelling backwards and forwards. That process, small process, eventually was stopped when relations with Pakistan and Afghanistan got too bad over Pashtunistan. Those were the sort of the migrating Kuchis. But, of course, on the border with Pakistan, there were tribes who were overlapping the borders. And as far as the tribes are concerned, they wanted to keep as much of their autonomy as possible. The Pakistanis had highly trained officials who went and got to know the habits and traditions of the tribal people and sympathized with them and worked out how to get influence and to stop them causing any particular problem. Sometimes there were mullahs who excited people and they started attacking British people. But on the whole, the situation was kept calm by very good Pakistanis trained by the British dealing with the local tribesmen. The Afghans dealt with the problems too in a different way. Dowd gave them heavy subsidies. So this was continued to be a problem, and of course it's continued a problem. That border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is still a difficult border, although some of the areas they've actually put real proper fences up there and so on. But in the old days, there was a lot of movement of these tribal people across all the whole area, actually.
Let me move perhaps on to another aspect of your interests and that developed in Afghanistan, which is very much the sense that Afghanistan still lives through its history and its politics. The Great Game has always been part of the British sort of engagement with Afghanistan. You have I think, a good collection of the authors and travellers of Afghanistan at the time. I just wonder, what are your impressions of how British history and engagement has influenced things, and perhaps who some of the more influential historical British figures were?
I suppose when I was there, it was fairly static. Afghanistan was a buffer state with the Americans and Russians on each side trying to influence things. It originally had been the Russians and the British. But of course, when British gave independence to India, we became far away and less important. The Americans became the most important power in the West, and they knew more about it, and the British were less involved. So it was the American ambassador and the Russian ambassador who were the key figures fighting each other, competing with each other in Kabul. I don't know whether I mentioned that when I was there, President Eisenhower visited. We weren't allowed to see him, but Khrushchev and Kosygin visited on the Russian side. And I remember the Russians gave a reception in a tent for the diplomatic corps, and there were very few diplomats. And there was Mr. Khrushchev shaking hands with people as they went into his tent. People went into these tents because the food was very difficult to find. And so when anyone was invited by any diplomatic organization to these events, they certainly turned up as they could. Sometimes they went up and I could see them putting their hands round and taking a whole lot of cigarettes out of a bowl and putting it in their pockets before they went out.
Going back to sort of some of the earlier travellers, you mentioned a short walk in the Hindu Kush, but you also have written about people like Elphinstone and others. I think the Durand family feature strongly in your books. I just wonder, what are the interesting historical figures from the British diplomatic side that you think have determined some of the trajectory of Afghanistan?
I was an old-fashioned diplomat, so before going, I got as many books to read about the situation and the history as possible. And later, more recently, I found that in the lockdown, I had time to reread those books. And some of those books I'd brought originally are now rather rare and rather valuable. And I was been re-looking at that whole period of the Great Game, the 19th century in Afghanistan, and these adventurers who went up into the area, because for a long period of time, after the fighting of the Safavids and the Mughals and so on, no one in Britain knew what was happening in Central Asia at all. We didn't know about Tashkent or Merv or these places. But some adventurers were going up there, and I can't remember all the names, but there was the famous Burns. Burns went out there. He had a junior job. This was by that time the East India Company had moved into Bengal and a bit of central India, but had kept away from the frontier, rather. And Burns was sent up. Actually, he was given a task of bringing some large horses up the Indus River to Ranjit Singh, who was the dynamic head of the Sikhs, who created the Sikh Empire, really, which we didn't invade. We had a good agreement with the Sikhs. We kept each away from each other. And he went off into Afghanistan then and had very brave areas. And then some other people followed him. There was an extraordinary man called Masson, who was really, he'd escaped from the British Army or the British Civil Service. But he was crazy about travelling, and he was very interested in anything to do with historical monuments or anything. And he collected coins, vast numbers of coins, which he eventually got back through Calcutta and various places back to the British Museum. I've written about some of these in my booklet, really, rather than a book, called Barrington's Afghan Octet, about some of those extraordinary characters at that time. People are not really well aware that one of the last of the great travelling conquerors in the Central Asia and that part of Asia was Nader Sharif Shah, the Persian king. We think of the Mughals and all these other people, but Nader Sharif Shah, in the time of the 18th century and so on, became an extremely powerful figure. And he conquered both in Iran, and established himself in Iran, and he invaded and conquered the Mughal Empire in India and created a new empire across both sides. And when he died eventually, his Afghan deputy, Ahmad Shah Durrani, took charge of the eastern side of his empire and created a dynasty of royal family of Afghans, the Durranis. And they ruled for quite a period of time until the British came up against them in the East India Company. And the story of those Afghan kings is interesting and is worthwhile examining. Some of them were decent, some of them behaved rather badly, but they tried to establish some principles of modern administration into Afghanistan. I found it very interesting to look at the background of there and see how much progress they'd made. Of course, we started to behave very badly then because we made some stupid mistakes of thinking that it was the best way of dealing with the Afghans was to support one faction against another and then to send in an army to support the faction we supported, which was a disaster. That was the first Afghan war. And then after that, there was a period of peace. And then in the second Afghan war, again, we started again invading Afghanistan. Then we quite rightly got fed up and withdrew and wanted for a period to have little to do with Afghanistan. We left Afghanistan alone. But Afghanistan themselves were concerned about Russian influence because the Russians were extending their rule over the whole of Siberia at that time and all those Central Asian cities. And they naturally looked to Afghanistan as a place they wanted to extend their empire down towards the sea and to rival the British, the East India Company. And the Afghans were in a difficult position. They were stuck between two groups. And in fact, towards the end, the Afghans became more sympathetic to us because they realized that we didn't want to extend our activities, our rule, further north. And the Russians did want to extend their activities down towards the sea. So they became more sympathetic to Britain at that time.
I'm very taken with that. I remember having a discussion with President Karzai, who was very interested in British history at the time and was concerned that the Britain hadn't gone further than it did do, and as a result, Afghanistan lost out in terms of transport infrastructure. It was one of his major concerns. But perhaps that takes us on to your time in Pakistan as High Commissioner, in terms of being there at the time of the Mujahideen and the fighting to remove the Russians at that time. You've also made the point that understanding the backgrounds and the differences to the different groups was very important in your understanding of the way in which a diplomat could work in Pakistan.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, actually the main problem in Pakistan was really relations with India, of course, because the border was disputed, because Kashmir was not solved, and it still has not been solved. Recently, it's been erupted again. Kashmir was a Muslim majority part of India, which opted for India, and Nehru had an effect in that and so on. And that was a major problem, became a major problem. Part of the problems the Pakistanis found was that they thought the Indians rather supported elements in Afghanistan which were hostile to them. So Pakistan felt themselves fenced in on both sides. And they had an efficient army, and the army behind the scenes was rather powerful. And nevertheless, there's a lot of politics going backwards and forwards on all sides. And Pakistan's relations with Afghanistan and with India take a long time to go into all the details about those things. Afghanistan was never really happy. Then later on, it was following up this problem with Dawood and Pashtunistan in the old days. There were elements in Afghanistan who thought that really large parts of India should really belong to them. It should be Pashtun controlled, which was never going to be possible. But we had to cope with all these things, and we had to deal with individuals. And it was interesting, most of the people I met who had dealt with the British in India admitted that the British had sometimes been arrogant, but had always been honest and had been trusted and been reliable. And they had considerable respect for the British officers in the old days and the British East India Company.
Perhaps going back to travels again, which of the historic places in Afghanistan have made the most impression on you?
Well, thank Bamiyan, of course. Bamiyan is amazing, the great Buddhas in Bamiyan. And the whole valley of Bamiyan is actually charming. It's a fascinating place. The hillsides are honeycomb with caves, out of which these two huge figures of Buddha were there. They've now been damaged and destroyed, of course, by the Taliban-type people, which is very sad, because they're part of Afghan history. The local people wanted it. They didn't care what they represented or not. They were part of the history, and of course they attracted tourists, which brought money into the area. I remember climbing up round the top of the big Bamiyan Buddha through the caves and seeing the paintings there and so on. Amazing experience, amazing view out of the top. There were one or two other Buddhist monuments around the area, which some of the local extreme Muslims thought that they should be destroyed. And that was no good, because one should respect the history of whatever it is, and it was part of the history. And most of the people were proud of the various monuments in their area. I think Bamiyan was the most important of all these areas I saw. There were some fine towers near Ghazni, which I remember being quite controversial in visiting.
And you were involved with some of the archaeologists who are working in Afghanistan and the French Archaeological Institute, amongst others. What were your impressions about the way that Afghanistan's tried to preserve its archaeology and culture?
The French were a major, important element of the society in Kabul when I was there. The head of their organization was Daniel Schlumberger, a man of great integrity. Unlike some archaeologists, he didn't take things home for his own personal use or his own personal portrayal. He was extremely honest, and the people with him we got on with very well. I had one pleasure going to one trip with them to a place called Surkotal, which was just up north of the Salang of the Hindu Kush barrier into the north. And there I was travelling around. This was an area where one had awfully to be careful travelling in the wild, because your vehicle might be attacked by local dogs, because huge dogs would attack you, because the local people felt it necessary to keep dogs to protect themselves from wolves. I remember that was one of the things one had to watch out for. And you see some local people walking from one place to another with these dogs around, but with a stick, being extremely careful, or with a judiciously thrown stone arriving exactly on the dog's nose. But anyway, on one of these trips, I went to stay with them for a few days with the French at Surkotal. It was a great sort of staircase of the Kushan period, the other side of the hills. And at the top of that, the French had made a nice place for them to have a little restaurant for themselves, a little food for themselves, and I had a place to sleep, and extremely good French food, and extremely good French wine. There was a huge sort of staircase, ancient staircase, going down the side of the hill away to the north, and the French cleared it gradually, showing the history. And what was interesting, at the very bottom of that staircase was a well. And just to be careful, they actually examined also the well. And it was in the well that they found a stone showing that this had been built by the famous Kushan king at the time, with his name and so on. So that just shows you that it's good to be thorough, because sometimes it's only the last minute you actually find the real source of this historic monument. This was a period when the people were living in about 200 AD, that sort of period.
And in terms of other anthropologists and archaeologists, I believe you also knew Louis Dupree and Nancy Dupree, whether you have any recollections of their work and travels. I mean, Nancy was a
Yes,
well-known
indeed.
character.
I should have mentioned Louis when talking about archaeology because he was one of the pioneers there. He was an American. He was a prehistorian, I think, but he decided to spend half his time in Afghanistan doing work he could on various projects, and half the time back in America raising money and talking to universities and things. And he was very articulate. He was very interested, and he pioneered a lot of ideas. He wrote good books about Afghanistan history, and he was extremely good company to be with. Later on, he did an extraordinary thing. After when I first met him, he had a good friend in the American embassy called Wolfe, and they swapped wives, which was rather surprising to most people, but it seemed to work very well. And Wolfe's wife became his wife, Nancy, who then became quite an archaeologist herself. And she stayed on after Louis died and so on, having various jobs with various UN agencies and things, looking after the monuments in Kabul. She was a great character. She helped restore some of the monuments which had been in the Kabul Museum. A lot of these monuments were always under threat by local people if you're not careful to look after them carefully. But she was one of the people who helped, and she was a great character herself.
So I think we're coming close to concluding on what's been a fascinating discussion. I wonder if you could just give us some overall reflections on your engagement with Afghanistan, what you think we should think of, what the British government should think of in terms of a better understanding of Afghanistan.
Perhaps before that, I can say a little more about the trouble I made in making contacts with members of the royal family. Particularly, I remember with Shah Mahmud Khan, who was one of the people who'd been prime minister at the end of the Second World War. And I got to know him because he entertained at a swimming pool for foreigners, and I used to quote Persian poetry to him, and he enjoyed me. And when he died, my visiting card was found by his family, and actually I joined the parade in the streets commemorating him. And when he died, I also decided, rather unusually, to go and attend his funeral, which was very much an Afghan family funeral. All his family was sitting there, the king and all the family were there, and various people were coming in and paying tribute to Shah Mahmud Khan, who was one of the better of that royal family. And I sat there calmly for some time, and I think it was respected. I know it was respected afterwards, and that I was probably the only foreign diplomat who ever did that. So that was the sort of thing I tried to do and to establish good relations with various people. I then became particularly interested in the family trees. I mean, I, with some American colleagues, realized that if you knew the whole family background of the main Afghan royal family, you would find a lot of the key people in all the important jobs and so on. And I found that was very interesting and very valuable for me. Now looking at the wider picture, I mean, first of all, we have an interest in peace in the world. I was happy to work as a British diplomat because if there was a problem, it was in Britain's interest to try and solve it because we were a great trading nation. And if it was not solved, we suffered. Our traders suffered. I remember in the beginning of the Indo-Pakistan fighting, there was a British ship which had been sequestered or taken away in Karachi, and another one which was taken away somewhere in India. And in both ships, we suffered in both cases, by both sides. So we had an interest in trying to solve the problems. And we tried to do that when we had more influence. Unfortunately, now I don't think we have the influence, unfortunately, to solve the problems that we used to, because we used to have really good people who understood the background, who understood the personalities, and could work out how to find an agreement between different sides, which gave each side a sort of a way of saving face, if necessary, in many cases, finding solutions. Afghanistan was a problem because it was a problem between the East and West, and it was a problem between the areas of India and Pakistan and some of those, and the Muslims and the non-Muslim and the Hindus and so on in the whole area. So Afghans themselves wanted to be left alone as far as possible. It was Field Marshal Roberts, was it, who said, the less the Afghans see of us, the more they will like us, which actually is a lot of common sense. So it's best to understand them, but not to get too much involved. I think we got too much involved in those Afghan wars very foolishly. I mean, we did some good things. Some of the Afghans were very grateful for what we'd done and how we kept the Russians out in particular, and so on. But we had to understand the situation. We had to take into account the different views on one side, and we had to work with our allies. And of course, our main ally was the United States in those days. I think Afghanistan, all these problems are still difficult in the world. I don't think they're solved by one man standing up and telling everyone exactly what should be done. I think we have to work out ourselves and try and get the views of different people, and not just the rich people, but the poorer people and the undisciplined people as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your reflections with us. What's been a fascinating journey back through time and into the future. Thank you, Sir Nicholas.